chapters 44 and 45 of History of Rome from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 44: Roman Roads, Provinces. The Romans were famous for their excellent public roads, from 13 to 15 feet wide. The roadbed was formed of 4 distinct layers, placed above the foundation. The upper layer was made of large polygonal blocks of the hardest stone, fitted and joined together so as to make an even surface. On each side of the road were footpaths strewn with gravel. Stone blocks for the use of equestrians were at regular distances, and also milestones telling the distance from Rome. There were 4 main public roads. 1. Via Appia, from Rome to Capua, Beneventum, Tarentum, and Brundisium. 2. Via Latina, from Rome to Aquinum and Teanum, joining the Via Appia at Beneventum. 3. Via Flaminia, the great northern road. In Umbria, near Acriculum and Narnia, a branch went east through Spoletium, joining the main line at Fulcinia. It then continued through Fanum, Flaminii, and Nuceria, where it again divided, one branch going to Fanum Fortunae on the Adriatic, the other to Ancona, and from there along the coast to Fanum Fortunae, where the 2 branches, again uniting, passed on to Ariminum through Pissarum. From here it was extended, under the name of Via Aemilia, into the heart of Cisalpine Gaul through Bononia, Mutina, Parma, and Placentia, where it crossed the Po to Mediolanum. 4. Via Aurelia, the great coast road, reached the west coast at Alsium, following the shore along through Etruria and Liguria by Genua, as far as Forum Julii in Gaul. Provinces. After the conquest of Italy, all the additional Roman dominions were divided into provinces. Sicily was the first Roman province. At first, praetors were appointed to govern these provinces, but afterwards persons who had been praetors at Rome were appointed at the expiration of their office with the title of propraetor. Later, the consuls also, at the end of their year of office, were sent to govern provinces with the title of proconsul. Such provinces were called provinciae consulares. The provinces were generally distributed by lot, but their distribution was sometimes arranged by agreement among those entitled to them. The tenure of office was usually a year, but it was frequently prolonged. When a new governor arrived in the province, his predecessor was expected to leave within 30 days. The governor was assisted by 2 quaestors, who had charge of the financial duties of the government. Originally, the governor was obliged to account at Rome for his administration, from his own books and those of the quaestors. But after 61 B.C., he was obliged to deposit 2 copies of his accounts in the 2 chief cities of his province, and to forward a 3rd to Rome. If the governor misconducted himself in the performance of his official duties, the provincials might apply for redress to the Senate, and to influential Romans who were their patrons. The governor received no salary, but was allowed to exact certain contributions from the people of the province for the support of himself and his retinue, which consisted of quaestors, secretary, notary, lictors, augurs, and public criers. His authority was supreme in military and civil matters, and he could not be removed from office. But after his term had ended, he could be tried for mismanagement. Many of the governors were rascals, and obtained by unfair means vast sums of money from the provincials. One of the most notorious of these was Verus, against whom Cicero delivered his Verrine orations. At the time of the battle of Actium there were 18 provinces, namely, Sicilia, 227. Footnote: the figures in parentheses indicate the date at which the province was established. Sardinia and Corsica, 227. Hispania Citerior, 205. Hispania Ulterior, 205. Illyricum, 167. Macedonia, 146. Africa, 146. Asia, 133. Achaia, 146. Gallia Citerior, 80. Gallia Narbonensis, 118. Cilicia, 63. Syria, 64. Bithynia and Pontus, 63. Cyprus, 55. Cyrenaica and Crete, 63. Numidia, 46. And Mauritania, 46. Under the emperors the following 16 were added: Rhoetia, Noricum, Pannonia, Moesia, Dacia, Britannia, Aegyptus, Cappadocia, Galatia, Rhodes, Lycia, Judea, Arabia, Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Assyria. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45. Footnote: most of the information given in this chapter is scattered in different parts of the history, but it seems well to condense it into one chapter for readier reference. Roman officers, etc. The magistrates of Rome were of two classes: the majores, or higher, and the minores, or lower. The former, except the censor, had the imperium; the latter did not. To the former class belonged the consuls, praetors, and censors, who were all elected in the Comitia Centuriata. The magistrates were also divided into two other classes, namely, curule and non-curule. The curule offices were those of dictator, magister equitum, consul, praetor, censor, and curule aedile. These officers had the right to sit in the sella curulis, chair of state. This chair was displayed upon all public occasions, especially in the circus and theatre, and it was the seat of the praetor when he administered justice. In shape it was plain, resembling a common folding camp stool with crooked legs. It was ornamented with ivory, and later overlaid with gold. The descendants of any one who had held a curule office were nobles, and had the right to place in their halls and to carry at funeral processions a wax mask of this ancestor, as well as of any other deceased members of the family of curule rank. A person who first held a curule office, and whose ancestors had never held one, was called a novus homo, that is, a new man. The most famous new men were Marius and Cicero. The magistrates were chosen only from the patricians in the early republic, but in course of time the plebeians shared these honors. The plebeian magistrates, properly so called, were the plebeian aediles and the tribuni plebis. All the magistrates, except the censor, were elected for 1 year, and all but the tribunes and quaestors, began their term of office on January 1st. The Tribune's year began December 10th, that of the Quaestor December 5th. The offices, except that of Tribune, formed a gradation, through which one must pass if he desired the consulship. The earliest age for holding each was, for the quaestorship, 27 years; for the aedileship, 37; for the praetorship, 40; and for the consulship, 43. No magistrate received any salary, and only the wealthy could afford to hold office. The Consuls. The 2 Consuls were the highest magistrates, except when a dictator was appointed, and were the chiefs of the administration. Their power was equal, and they had the right before all others of summoning the Senate and the Comitia Centuriata, in each of which they presided. When both Consuls were in the city, they usually took turns in performing the official duties, each acting a month, and during this time the Consul was always accompanied in public by 12 lictors, who preceded him in single file, each carrying on his shoulders a bundle of rods (fasces), to signify the power of the magistrate to scourge criminals. Outside the city these fasces showed an axe projecting from each bundle, signifying the power of the magistrate to behead criminals. At the expiration of his year of office, the Consul was sent to govern a province for 1 year, and was then called the Proconsul. He was chief in his province in all military, civil, and criminal cases. Praetors. There were 8 praetors, whose duties were to administer justice (judges). After the expiration of their year of office, they went as propraetors to govern provinces. The most important praetor was called Praetor Urbanus. He had charge of all civil suits between Roman citizens. In the absence of both Consuls from the city, he acted in their place. Each praetor was attended by 2 lictors in the city, and by 6 outside. The Praetor Peregrinus had charge of civil cases in which one or both parties were aliens. The other 6 praetors presided over the permanent criminal courts. Aediles. The Aediles were 4 officers who had the general superintendence of the police of the city, and the care of the public games and buildings. 2 of the Aediles were taken from the plebeians, and 2, called curule Aediles, ranked with the higher magistrates, and might be patricians. They were elected in the Comitia Tributa. Their supervision of the public games gave them great opportunities for gaining favor with the populace, who then, as now, delighted in circuses and contests. A small sum was appropriated from the public treasury for these games, but an Aedile usually expended much from his own purse to make the show magnificent, and thus to gain votes for the next office, that of Praetor. Only the very wealthy could afford to hold this office. Quaestors. There were 20 quaestors. 2 were city treasurers at Rome, having charge also of the archives. The others were assigned to the different governors of the provinces, and acted as quartermasters. Through their clerks, the 2 city quaestors kept the accounts, received the taxes, and paid out the city's money, as directed by the Senate. A quaestor always accompanied every imperator (general) in the field as his quartermaster. The elections for quaestors were held in the Comitia Tributa. Tribuni Plebis. there were 10 tribunes, elected in the Comitia Tributa. They were always plebeians, and their chief power lay in their right to veto any decree of the Senate, any law of the Comitia, and any public act of a magistrate. Their persons were considered sacred, and no one could hinder them in the discharge of their official duties under penalty of death. They called together the Comitia Tributa, and they also had authority to convene the Senate and preside over it. Sulla succeeded in restricting their power, but Pompey restored it. The tribunes did not possess the imperium. Censors. There were 2 censors, chosen from ex-consuls, and they held office for 18 months. They were elected once every 5 years, this period being called a lustrum. They ranked as higher magistrates without possessing the imperium. Their duties were: 1. To take the census, that is, register the citizens and their amount of property, and to fill all vacancies in the Senate. 2. To have a general oversight of the finances, like our Secretary of the Treasury, to contract for the erecting of public buildings, and for the making or repairing of public roads, sewers, etc. To let out the privilege of collecting the taxes for 5 years to the highest bidder. (Footnote: In the intervals of the censorship, the duties under No. 2 fell to the Aediles. 3. To punish gross immorality by removal of the guilty parties from the Senate, the Equites, or the tribe. Dictator. In cases of great danger, the Senate called upon the consuls to appoint a dictator, who should possess supreme power, but whose tenure of office could never exceed 6 months. In later times, dictators were not appointed, but consuls were invested with the authority if it was thought necessary. Sulla and Caesar, however, revived the office, but changed its tenure, the latter holding it for life. Magister Equitum. This was an officer appointed by the dictator to stand next in authority to him, and act as a sort of vice dictator. Pontifices. The priests formed a body, collegium, of 15 members, at the head of whom was the Pontifex Maximus, high priest. Their tenure of office was for life, and they were responsible to no one in the discharge of their duties. Their influence was necessarily very great. Imperium. This was a power to command the armies, and to exercise judicial functions conferred upon a magistrate, dictator, consul, or praetor, by a special law passed by the Comitia Curiata. The imperium could be exercised only outside of the city walls (Pomorium), except by special permission of the Senate, for the purpose of celebrating a triumph. The one receiving the imperium was called Imperator. Potestas. This was the power, in general, which all magistrates possessed. End of chapter 45. End of section 18. Chapters 46 and 47 of History of Rome, from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F. Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. Houses, Customs, Institutions, etc. The private houses of the Romans were poor affairs until after the conquest of the East, when money began to pour into the city. Many houses of immense size were then erected, adorned with columns, paintings, statues, and costly works of art. Some of these houses are said to have cost as much as $2,000,000. The principal parts of a Roman house were the vestibulum, ostium, atrium, alae, tablinum, fauces, and peristylium. The vestibulum was a court surrounded by the house on three sides, and open on the fourth to the street. The ostium corresponded in general to our front hall. From it a door opened into the atrium, which was a large room with an opening in the center of its roof, through which the rain water was carried into a cistern placed in the floor under the opening. To the right and left of the atrium were side rooms called the alae, and the tablinum was a balcony attached to it. The passages from the atrium to the interior of the house were called fauces. The peristylium, towards which these passages ran, was an open court surrounded by columns, decorated with flowers and shrubs. It was somewhat larger than the atrium. The floors were covered with stone, marble, or mosaics. The walls were lined with marble slabs or frescoed, while the ceilings were either bare, exposing the beams, or, in the finer houses, covered with ivory, gold, and frescoing. The main rooms were lighted from above. The side rooms received their light from these, and not through windows looking into the street. The windows of rooms in upper stories were not supplied with glass until the time of the Empire. They were merely openings in the wall, covered with lattice work. To heat a room, portable stoves were generally used, in which charcoal was burned. There were no chimneys, and the smoke passed out through the windows or the openings in the roofs. The rooms of the wealthy were furnished with great splendor. The walls were frescoed with scenes from Greek mythology, landscapes, etc. In the vestibules were fine sculptures, costly marble walls, and doors ornamented with gold, silver, and rare shells. There were expensive rugs from the East, and, in fact, everything that could be obtained likely to add to the attractiveness of the room. Candles were used in early times, but later the wealthy used lamps, which were made of terra cotta or bronze. They were mostly oval, flat on the top, often with figures in relief. In them were one or more round holes to admit the wick. They either rested on tables or were suspended by chains from the ceiling. Meals. The meals were the jentaculum, prandium, and cana. The first was our breakfast, though served at an early hour, sometimes as early as 4 o'clock. It consisted of bread, cheese, and dried fruits. The prandium was a lunch served about noon. The cana, or dinner, served between 3 and sunset, was usually of 3 courses. The first course consisted of stimulants, eggs, or lettuce and olives. The second, which was the main course, consisted of meats, fowl, or fish, with condiments. The third course was made up of fruits, nuts, sweetmeats, and cakes. At elaborate dinners, the guests assembled, each with his napkin and full dress of bright colors. The shoes were removed so as not to soil the couches. These couches usually were adapted for 3 guests, who reclined, resting the head on the left hand, with the elbow supported by pillows. The Romans took the food with their fingers. Dinner was served in a room called the triclinium. In Nero's Golden House, the dining room was constructed like a theatre, with shifting scenes to change with every course. Dress, bathing. The Roman men usually wore two garments, the tunica and toga. The former was a short woolen undergarment with short sleeves. To have a long tunic with long sleeves was considered a mark of effeminacy. The tunic was girded round the waist with a belt. The toga was peculiarly a Roman garment, and none but citizens were allowed to wear it. It was also the garment of peace, in distinction from the sagum, which was worn by soldiers. The toga was of white wool, and was nearly semicircular, but being a cumbrous garment, it became customary in later times to wear it only on state occasions. The poor wore only the tunic. Others wore, in place of the toga, the lacerna, which was an open cloak, fastened to the right shoulder by a buckle. Boys until about 16 wore a toga with a purple hem. The women wore a tunic, stola, and pulla. The stola was a loose garment, gathered in and girdled at the waist with a deep flounce extending to the feet. The pulla was a sort of shawl to throw over the whole figure, and to be worn out of doors. The ladies indulged their fancy for ornaments as freely as their purses would allow. Footgear was mostly of two kinds, the calceus and the soleil. The former was much like our shoe, and was worn in the street. The latter were sandals, strapped to the bare foot, and worn in the house. The poor used wooden shoes. Bathing was popular among the wealthy. Fine buildings were erected, with elegant decorations, and all conveniences for cold, warm, hot, and vapor baths. These bath houses were very numerous, and were places of popular resort. Attached to many of them were rooms for exercise, with seats for spectators. The usual time for bathing was just before dinner. Upon leaving the bath, it was customary to anoint the body with oil. Festivals, games, etc. The Saturnalia was the festival of Saturn, to whom the inhabitants of Latium attributed the introduction of agriculture and the arts of civilized life. It was celebrated near the end of December, corresponding to our Christmas holidays, and under the Empire lasted 7 days. During its continuance, no public business was transacted, the law courts were closed, the schools had a holiday, and slaves were relieved from all ordinary toil. All classes devoted themselves to pleasure, and presents were interchanged among friends. The Lupercalia, a festival in honor of Lupercus, the god of fertility, was celebrated on the 15th of February. It was one of the most ancient festivals, and was held in the Lupercal, where Romulus and Remus were said to have been nursed by the she wolf Lupa. The priests of Lupercus were called Luperci. They formed a collegium, but their tenure of office is not known. On the day of the festival, these priests met at the Lupercal, offered sacrifice of goats, and took a meal, with plenty of wine. They then cut up the skins of the goats which they had sacrificed. With some of these they covered parts of their bodies, and with others they made thongs, and holding them in their hands, ran through the streets of Rome, striking with them all whom they met, especially women, as it was believed this would render them fruitful. The Quirinalia was celebrated on the 17th of February, when Quirinus Romulus was said to have been carried up to heaven. Gladiators were men who fought with swords in the amphitheatre and other places, for the amusement of the people. These shows were first exhibited at Rome in 264 B.C., and were confined to public funerals. But afterwards gladiators were to be seen at the funerals of most men of rank. Under the Empire the passion for this kind of amusement increased to such an extent that gladiators were kept and trained in schools (ludi), and their trainers were called lanistae. The person who gave an exhibition was called an editor. He published (edere) some time before the show a list of the combatants. In the show the fights began with wooden swords, but at the sound of the trumpet these were exchanged for steel weapons. When a combatant was wounded, if the spectators wished him spared, they held their thumbs down, but turned them up if they wanted him killed. Gladiators who had served a long time were often discharged and presented with a wooden sword (rudis). Hence they were called rudiarii. The amphitheatre, theatre, and circus. The amphitheatre was a place for the exhibition of gladiatorial shows, combats of wild beasts, and naval engagements. Its shape was that of an ellipse, surrounded by seats for the spectators. The word amphitheatre was first applied to a wooden building erected by Caesar. Augustus built one of stone in the Campus Martius, but the most celebrated amphitheatre was built by Vespasian and Titus, and dedicated in 80 A.D. It is still standing, though partly in ruins, covers nearly 6 acres, and could seat 90,000 people. The name given to it today is the Colosseum. The open space in the center was called the arena, and was surrounded by a wall about 15 feet high to protect the spectators from the wild beasts. Before the time of Caesar, the shows were held in the Forum and in the Circus. The theatre was never as popular with the Romans as with the Greeks. The plays of Plautus and Terence were acted on temporary wooden stages. The first stone theatre was built by Pompey in 55 B.C. near the Campus Martius. It was a fine building, with a seating capacity of 40,000. The seats were arranged in a semicircle, as at present, the orchestra being reserved for the senators and other distinguished persons. Then came 14 rows of seats for the equites, and behind these sat the ordinary crowd. The Circus Maximus, between the Palatine and Aventine hills, was built for chariot races, boxing, and gymnastic contests. It was an immense structure, with galleries 3 stories high, and a canal called Euripus, and it accommodated 100,000 spectators. In the center, Caesar erected an obelisk 132 feet high, brought from Egypt. The seats were arranged as in the theatre. 6 kinds of games were celebrated. First, chariot racing. Second, a sham fight between young men on horseback. Third, a sham fight between infantry and cavalry. Fourth, athletic sports of all kinds. Fifth, fights with wild beasts, such as lions, boars, etc. Sixth, sea fights. Water was let into the canal to float ships. The combatants were captives or criminals condemned to death, who fought until one party was killed, unless saved by the kindness of the Emperor. A triumphal procession. The Imperator, when he returned from a successful campaign, was sometimes allowed to enjoy a triumphal procession, provided he had been Dictator, Consul, or Praetor. No one desiring a triumph ever entered the city until the Senate decided whether or not he deserved one. When a favorable decision was reached, the temples were all thrown open, garlands of flowers decorated every shrine and image, and incense smoked on every altar. The Imperator ascended the triumphal car and entered a city gate, where he was met by the whole body of the Senate, headed by the magistrates. The procession then proceeded in the following order: 1. The Senate, headed by the magistrates. 2. A troop of trumpeters. 3. Carts laden with spoils, often very costly and numerous. 4. A body of flute players. 5. White bulls and oxen for sacrifice. 6. Elephants and rare animals from the conquered countries. 7. The arms and insignia of the leaders of the conquered enemy. 8. The leaders themselves, with their relatives and other captives. 9. The lictors of the Imperator in single file, their fasces wreathed with laurel. 10. The Imperator himself, in a circular chariot drawn by 4 horses. He was attired in a gold-embroidered robe and a flowered tunic. He held a laurel bough in his right hand, a scepter in his left, and his brow was encircled with a laurel wreath. 11. The grown-up sons and officers of the Imperator. 12. The whole body of infantry, with spears adorned with laurel. The ovation was a sort of smaller triumph. The commander entered the city on foot, or in later times on horseback. He was clothed in a purple bordered robe. His head was crowned with laurel, and a sheep (ovis) was sacrificed, instead of a bull, as in the case of a triumph. Pomerium. The pomerium was the sacred enclosure of the city, inside of which no person holding the imperium was allowed to enter. It did not always run parallel to the city walls. Names. Every man in Rome had 3 names. The given name, praenomen, as Lucius, Marcus, Gaius. The name of the gens, nomen, as Cornelius, Tullius, Julius. The name of the family, cognomen, as Scipio, Cicero, Caesar. To these names was sometimes added another, the agnomen, given for some exploit, or to show that the person was adopted from some other gens. Thus, Scipio the elder was called Africanus, and all his descendants had the right to the name. Africanus the younger was adopted from the Cornelian gens into the Aemilian gens. Therefore he added to his other names Aemilianus. The women were called only by the name of their gens. The daughter of Scipio was called, for example, Cornelia, and to distinguish her from others of the Cornelian gens, she was called Cornelia, daughter of Scipio. If there were more than one daughter, to the name of the eldest was added prima, first; to that of the next, secunda, second, etc. Marriage. Intermarriage, connubium, between patricians and plebeians was forbidden previous to 445, and after that the offspring of such marriages took the rank of the father. After the parties had agreed to marry, and the consent of the parents or persons in authority was given, the marriage contract was drawn up and signed by both parties. The wedding day was then fixed upon. This could not fall upon the calends, nones, or ides of any month, or upon any day in May or February. The bride was dressed in a long white robe with a bridal veil and shoes of a bright yellow color. She was conducted in the evening to her future husband's home by 3 boys, one of whom carried before her a torch, the other 2 supporting her by the arm. They were accompanied by friends of both parties. The groom received the bride at the door, which she entered with distaff and spindle in hand. The keys of the house were then delivered to her. The day ended with a feast given by the husband, after which the bride was conducted to the bridal couch in the atrium, which was adorned with flowers. On the following day another feast was given by the husband, and the wife performed certain religious rites. The position of the Roman woman after marriage was very different from that of the Greek. She presided over the whole household, educated her children, watched over and preserved the honor of the house, and shared the honors and respect shown to her husband. Funerals. When a Roman was at the point of death, his nearest relative present endeavored to catch the last breath with his mouth. The ring was removed from the dying person's hand, and as soon as he was dead, his eyes and mouth were closed by the nearest relative, who called upon the deceased by name, exclaiming, "Farewell." The body was then washed and anointed with oil and perfumes by slaves or undertakers. A small coin was placed in the mouth of the body to pay the ferryman (Charon) in Hades, and the body was laid out on a couch in the vestibulum, with its feet toward the door. In early times all funerals were held at night, but in later times only the poor followed this custom, mainly because they could not afford display. The funeral, held the 9th day after the death, was headed by musicians playing mournful strains, and mourning women hired to lament and sing the funeral song. These were sometimes followed by players and buffoons, one of whom represented the character of the deceased, and imitated his words and actions. Then came the slaves whom the deceased had liberated, each wearing the cap of liberty. Before the body were carried the images of the dead and of his ancestors, and also the crown and military rewards which he had gained. The couch on which the body was carried was sometimes made of ivory, and covered with gold and purple. Following it were the relatives in mourning, often uttering loud lamentations, the women beating their breasts and tearing their hair. The procession of the most illustrious dead passed through the Forum, and stopped before the Rostra, where a funeral oration was delivered. From here the body was carried to its place of burial, which must be outside the city. Bodies were sometimes cremated, and in the later times of the Republic this became quite common. Education. In early times the education of the Romans was confined to reading, writing, and arithmetic, but as they came in contact with the Greeks, a taste for higher education was acquired. Greek slaves (paedagogi) were employed in the wealthy families to watch over the children, and to teach them to converse in Greek. A full course of instruction included the elementary branches mentioned above, and a careful study of the best Greek and Latin writers, besides a course in philosophy and rhetoric under some well-known professor abroad, usually at Athens or Rhodes. Books. Letter writing. The most common material on which books were written was the thin rind of the Egyptian papyrus tree. Besides the papyrus, parchment was often used. The paper or parchment was joined together so as to form one sheet, and was rolled on a staff, whence the name volume, from volvere, to roll. Letter writing was very common among the educated. Letters were usually written with the stylus, an iron instrument like a pencil in size and shape, on thin slips of wood or ivory covered with wax, and folded together with the writing on the inside. The slips were tied together by a string, and the knot was sealed with wax and stamped with a signet ring. Letters were also written on parchment with ink. Special messengers were employed to carry letters, as there was no regular mail service. Roman letters differed from ours chiefly in the opening and close. The writer always began by sending greeting to the person addressed, and closed with a simple farewell, without any signature. Thus, Cicero S.D. Pompeo (SD = sends greeting) would be the usual opening of a letter from Cicero to Pompey. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47. Public buildings, squares, etc. Rome was built on 7 hills: the Palatine, the Aventine, the Capitoline, the Esquiline, the largest, the Quirinal, the Viminal, and the Caelian. There were various public squares. Forum = square or park. Some were places of resort for public business, and most were adorned with porticos. The most celebrated square was the Forum Romanum, or simply the Forum. There were also the Forum Caesaris and Forum Trajani. Some served as markets, as Forum Boarium, the cattle market; Forum Suarium, the hog market, etc. Temples were numerous. The Pantheon, temple of all the gods, built by Agrippa and restored by Hadrian, was dedicated to Jupiter. It was situated outside of the city, in the Campus Martius, and is now used as a Christian church. The temple of Apollo Palatinus, built by Augustus, was on the Palatine Hill. It contained a library, which was founded by Augustus. The temple of Aesculapius was on an island in the Tiber. That of Concordia, on the slope of the Capitoline Hill, was dedicated in 377 B.C., and restored by Tiberius. The temple of Janus was an arched passage east of the Forum, the gates of which were open during war. Up to the time of Ovid, the gates had been closed but 3 times: once in Numa's reign, again at the close of the battle of Actium. Janus was one of the oldest Latin divinities, and was represented with a face in front and another on the back of his head. From him is named the month of January. There were several temples of Jupiter, the most famous of which was that of Jupiter Optimus, Maximus, or Capitolinus, built during the dynasty of the Tarquins, and splendidly adorned. See Chapter 5. There were also numerous temples of Juno, of Mars, and of other deities. The Colosseum was the largest building in Rome. There were 3 theatres, that of Pompey, of Marcellus, and of Balbus, and several circuses, the most famous of which was the Circus Maximus. The Basilicae were halls of justice, court houses. The most important was the Basilica Julia, begun by Caesar, and finished by Augustus, which was situated on the south side of the Forum, and the foundations of which can still be seen. The Curia, or Senate House, was in the Forum. Each of the 30 curiae had a place of meeting called also a curia, where were discussed public questions pertaining to politics, finance, or religion. The public baths were numerous. There were thermae, hot baths, of Nero, of Titus, of Trajan, of Caracalla, and of others, ruins of which still exist. Pure water was brought into the city from the surrounding hills by 14 different aqueducts, all of which were well built, and 3 of which are still in use. The first aqueduct, Aqua Appia, was built about 313 B.C. by Appius Claudius. Sewers intersected Rome in all directions, and some were of immense size. The Cloaca Maxima, built by Tarquin, was the largest, and is still in use. Its innermost arch has a diameter of 14 feet. There are said to have been 20 triumphal arches, of which 5 now remain. 1. The Arch of Drusus, on the Appian Way, erected in honor of Claudius Drusus. 2. The Arch of Titus, at the foot of the Palatine Hill, built by Titus to commemorate his conquest of Judea. The bas reliefs on this arch represent the spoils taken from the temple at Jerusalem, carried in triumphal procession. 3. The Arch of Septimius Severus, built by the Senate in 207 A.D., at the end of the Via Sacra, in honor of the Emperor and his 2 sons, for their conquest of the Parthians and Arabians. 4. The Arch of Gallienus. 5. The Arch of Constantine. There were 2 famous mausolea, that of Augustus, now in ruins, and that of Hadrian, which, stripped of its ornaments, is now the castle of San Angelo. The columns commemorating persons or events were numerous. The most remarkable of these were erected for naval victories, and called columnae rostratae. The one of Duilius, in honor of the victory at Mylae, 261 B.C., still stands. It has 3 ship beaks attached to each side. Columns were built in honor of several emperors. That of Trajan is perhaps best known. The Columna Miliaria was a milestone set up by Augustus in the Forum, from which all distances on the different public roads were measured. It was called Miliarium Aureum, or the Golden Milestone. End of chapter 47. End of section 19. Chapters 48 through 50 of History of Rome, from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F. Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 48. Colonies, the Calendar, Religion. Colonies were established by Rome throughout its whole history. They were intended to keep in check a conquered people, and also to repress hostile incursions. Many were founded to provide for veteran soldiers, a practice which was begun by Sulla and continued under the emperors. No colony was established without a lex, plebiscitum, or senatus consultum. Religious ceremonies always accompanied their foundation, and the anniversary was observed. The colonies were divided into 2 classes, namely, Roman and Latin or military. Members of the former class had all the rights of Roman citizens. Those of the latter could not vote in the comitia at Rome. The Latini, who were once Roman citizens, and who always felt equal to them, were uneasy in their subordinate position. But by the Julian law, passed in 90 B.C., they acquired the right of voting at Rome, and were placed on the same footing as Roman colonists. The calendar. The Roman year began with March. There were 12 months, and each month had 3 divisions: the calends, nones, and ides. The calends fell on the first of the month, the nones on the 7th of March, May, July, and October; in other months on the 5th. The ides came 8 days after the nones. If an event happened on these divisions, it was said to occur on the calends, nones, or ides of the month. If it happened between any of these divisions, it was said to occur so many days before the division following the event. The year was reckoned from the foundation of the city, 753 B.C., and often the names of the consuls of that year were added. Religion. The Romans were religious, and had numerous gods and goddesses. Jupiter and Juno, the god and goddess of light; Saturn, the god of seed sowing; Tellus, the goddess of the nourishing earth; Ceres, the goddess of growth; Consus and Ops, who presided over the harvest; Pales, the god of the flocks; and Lupercus, the god of fertility. Various festivals were celebrated in honor of these, as the Saturnalia in December, the Tellilia (Tellus), Cerealia (Ceres), and Palilia (Pales) in April, and the Lupercalia in February. Vesta was the goddess of the house, and as every family had an altar erected for her worship, so the state, as a combination of families, had a common altar to her in the temple of Vesta. In this temple were also worshipped the Penátes and Lares. The Lares were special guardians of private houses. Some protected fields and cities. Images of Lares of diminutive size, clad often in dog skins, were ranged along the hearth. The people honored them on the calends of May and other festival days by decking them with flowers, and by offering them wine, incense, flour, and portions of their meals upon plates. The Penátes were kept and worshipped only in the inmost chambers of houses and temples. Their statues, made of wax, wood, or ivory, were also kept in the inner hall. The priestesses of Vesta were 6 in number, and were called Vestal Virgins. When a Vestal was to be elected, the Pontifex Maximus chose 20 young girls from high families. Of these, one was chosen by lot to fill the vacancy, and she was bound to serve for 30 years. The Vestals were preceded by a lictor when in public. They had private seats in the public shows, and had the power of delivering from punishment any condemned person they happened to meet. They wore white dresses and white fillets. Their chief duty was to keep the fire always burning on the hearth (focus publicus) in the temple. They could not marry. Flamines. The Flamines were priests devoted to the service of some particular god. There were 15, and they were chosen first in the Comitia Curiáta, and afterwards, probably, in the Tributa. The most distinguished of all the Flamines was the Flamen Dialis, Jupiter. He had the right to a lictor, to the Sella Curulis, and to a seat in the Senate. If one in bonds took refuge in his house, the chains were at once removed. This priest, however, could not be away from the city a single night, and was forbidden to sleep out of his own bed for 3 consecutive nights. He was not allowed to mount a horse, or even to touch one, or to look upon an army outside of the city walls. The Salii. These were priests of Mars, 12 in number, and always chosen from the patricians. They celebrated the festival of Mars on the 1st of March, and for several successive days. The Augures. This body varied in number, from 3 in early times to 16 in the time of Caesar. It was composed of men who were believed to interpret the will of the gods, and to declare whether the omens were favorable or otherwise. No public act of any kind could be performed, no election held, no law passed, no war waged, without first consulting the omens. There was no appeal from the decision of the augurs, and hence their power was great. They held office for life, and were a close corporation, filling their own vacancies until 103 B.C. The Fetiales. This was another body of priests, holding office for life, and numbering probably 20. They were expected, whenever any dispute arose with other nations, to demand satisfaction, to determine whether hostilities should be begun, and to preside at any ratification of peace. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49. The Roman army in Caesar's time. The legio was composed of infantry, and, though larger, corresponded to our regiment. It was divided into 10 cohorts, battalions, each cohort into 3 maniples, companies, and each maniple into 2 centuries, platoons. In theory, the number in each legion was 6,000; in practice, about 4,000. The usual order of battle was to draw up each legion in 3 lines, acies triplex, the first consisting of 4 cohorts, the second and third of 3 each. The defensive armor of the legionary soldier was a helmet of metal or leather, a shield 4 feet by 2½ greaves, and corselets of various material. The outer garment was a woolen blanket, fastened to the shoulders by a buckle. Higher officers wore a long purple cloak. The offensive armor was a short, straight, 2-edged sword, gladius, about 2 feet long, worn by privates on the right side so as not to interfere with the shield, but on the left side by officers. The javelin, pilum, was a heavy wooden shaft with an iron head, the whole about 7 feet long, and weighing fully 10 pounds. All legionary soldiers were Roman citizens. The auxiliaries were hired or drafted troops, and were always light armed. The cavalry in Caesar's time was made up of auxiliaries taken from the different provinces. The officers were: 1. The Imperator, or commander in chief. 2. The Legati, or staff officers, varying in number. Caesar had 10. 3. The Quaestor, or quartermaster. 4. The Tribuni Militum, numbering 6 in each legion, and assisting the Imperator in his duties. 5. The Praefecti, who held various subordinate commands. 6. The Centuriones, who were non-commissioned officers, and rose in rank for good service. There were 60 centurions in each legion, 6 in each cohort, and one in each century. They were promoted from the ranks, but rarely rose above centurion of the first rank. All the officers, except the centurions, came from either senatorial or equestrian families. The cohors praetoria was a body of picked troops that acted as bodyguard to the Imperator. The standard (signum) of the legion was an eagle with outstretched wings, perched upon a pole. The Romans, when on the march, fortified their camp every night. They made it rectangular in shape, and threw up fortifications always in the same way. It was surrounded by a ditch and rampart. The legionary soldiers encamped next to the wall on the inside of the fortifications, thus surrounding the cavalry, the auxiliaries, the general, and his staff. The general's tent was called the Praetorium, and the entrance to the camp in front of his tent was called the Praetorian Gate. The opposite entrance was called the Decuman Gate. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50. Legendary Rome. Aeneas, son of Anchises and Venus, fled from Troy after its capture by the Greeks, 1184, and came to Italy. He was accompanied by his son Iúlus and a number of brave followers. Latinus, who was king of the district where Aeneas landed, received him kindly, and gave him his daughter Lavinia in marriage. Aeneas founded a city, which he named Lavinium in honor of his wife. After his death, Iúlus, also called Ascanius, became king. He founded on Mount Albanus a city, which he called Alba Longa, and to it transferred the capital. Here a number of kings ruled in succession, the last of whom was Silvius Procas, who left two sons, Numitor the older, and Amulius. They divided the kingdom, the former choosing the property, the latter the crown. Numitor had two children, a son and a daughter. Amulius, fearing that they might aspire to the throne, murdered the son, and made the daughter, Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin. This he did to prevent her marrying, for this was forbidden to Vestal virgins. She, however, became pregnant by Mars, and had twin sons, whom she named Romulus and Remus. When Amulius was informed of this, he cast their mother into prison, and ordered the boys to be drowned in the Tiber. At this time the river was swollen by rains, and had overflowed its banks. The boys were thrown into a shallow place, escaped drowning, and, the water subsiding, they were left on dry land. A she wolf, hearing their cries, ran to them and suckled them. Faustulus, a shepherd who was near by, seeing this, took the boys home and reared them. When they grew up and learned who they were, they killed Amulius, and gave the kingdom to their grandfather Numitor. Then, 753, they founded a city on Mount Palatinus, which they called Rome, after Romulus. While they were building a wall around this city, Remus was killed in a quarrel with his brother. Romulus, first king of Rome, ruled for 37 years, 753 through 716. He found the city needed inhabitants, and to increase their number, he opened an asylum to which many refugees fled. But wives were needed. To supply this want, he celebrated games, and invited the neighboring people, the Sabines, to attend the sports. When all were engaged in looking on, the Romans suddenly made a rush and seized the Sabine virgins. This bold robbery caused a war, which finally ended in a compromise in a sharing of the city with the Sabines. Romulus then chose 100 senators, whom he called patres. He also divided the people into 30 wards. In the 37th year of his reign he disappeared, and was believed to have been taken up into heaven. 1 year followed without any king, and then Numa Pompilius, 716 673, a Sabine from Cures, was chosen. He was a good man and a great lawgiver. Many sacred rites were instituted by him to civilize his barbarous subjects. He reformed the calendar, and built a temple to the god Janus. Tullus Hostilius, 673 641, succeeded him. His reign was noted for the fall of Alba Longa. Then came Ancus Marcius, 640 616, the grandson of Numa. He was a good ruler and popular. He conquered the Latins, enlarged the city, and built new walls around it. He was the first to build a prison and to bridge the Tiber. Footnote: this bridge was called the Pons Sublicius, that is, a bridge resting on piles. He also founded a city at its mouth, which he called Ostia. The next 3 kings were of Etruscan origin. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, 616 578, went to Rome first during the reign of Ancus, and, becoming a favorite of his, was appointed guardian of his sons. After the death of Ancus, he wrested the government from them and became king himself. He increased the senators to 200, carried on many wars successfully, and thus enlarged the territory of the city. He built the Cloaca Maxima, or Great Sewer, which is used today. Tarquin also began the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the Capitoline Hill. He was killed in the 38th year of his reign by the sons of Ancus, from whom he had snatched the kingdom. His successor was his son-in-law Servius Tullius, 578 534, who enlarged the city still more, built a temple to Diana, and took a census of the people. It was found that the city and suburbs contained 83,000 souls. Servius was killed by his daughter Tullia and her husband Tarquinius Superbus, son of Priscus. Tarquinius Superbus succeeded to the throne 534 510. He was energetic in war, and conquered many neighboring places, among which was Ardea, a city of the Rutuli. He finished the temple of Jupiter, begun by his father. He also obtained the Sibylline books. A woman from Cumae, a Greek colony, came to him, and offered for sale 9 books of oracles and prophecies, but the price seemed exorbitant, and he refused to purchase them. The Sibyl then burned 3, and, returning, asked the same price for the remaining 6. The king again refused. She burned 3 more, and obtained from the monarch for her last 3 the original price. These books were preserved in the Capitol and held in great respect. They were destroyed with the temple by fire on July 6, 83. 2 men had charge of them, who were called Duoviri Sacrorum. The worship of the Greek deities Apollo and Latona, among others, was introduced through these books. In 510, a conspiracy was formed against Tarquin by Brutus, Collatinus, and others, and the gates of the city were closed against him. Footnote: the cause of the conspiracy was the violence offered by Sextus, Tarquin's son, to Lucretia, wife of Collatinus, unable to bear the humiliation she killed herself in the presence of her family, having first appealed to them to avenge her wrongs. A republic was then formed, with 2 consuls at the head of the government. Tarquin made 3 attempts to recover his power at Rome, all unsuccessful. Footnote: the victory of Lake Regillus, which has been painted by Macaulay in glowing colors, was gained over Tarquin in 509. In the last attempt, 508, he was assisted by Porsenna, king of the Etruscans. They advanced against the city from the north. Horatius Cocles, a brave young man, alone defended the bridge, Pans Sublicius, over the Tiber until it was torn down behind him. He then swam the river in safety to his friends. Footnote: see Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. During the siege of the city, Quintus Mucius Scaevola, a courageous youth, stole into the camp of the enemy with the intention of killing King Porsenna, but by mistake killed his secretary instead. He was seized and carried to Porsenna, who tried to frighten him by threats of burning. Instead of replying, Scaevola held his right hand on the burning altar until it was consumed. The king, admiring this heroic act, pardoned him. Out of gratitude, Scaevola told the king that 300 other men as brave as himself had sworn to kill him. Porsenna was so alarmed that he made peace, and withdrew from the city. Mucius received his name, Scaevola, left-handed, on account of this loss of his right hand. Tarquin went to Tusculum, where he spent the rest of his days in retirement. In 494, the plebeians at Rome rebelled because they were exhausted by taxes and military service. A large part of them left the city and crossed the Anio to a mountain, Mons Sacer, near by. The Senate sent Menenius Agrippa to treat with them. By his exertions, Menenius is said to have related for them the famous fable of the belly and members. The people were induced to return to the city, and for the first time were allowed to have officers chosen from their own ranks to represent their interests. These officers were called Tribuni Plebis. 2 years later, 492, Gaius Marcius, one of the patricians, met and defeated the Volsci, a neighboring tribe, at Corioli. For this he received the name of Coriolanus. During a famine, he advised that grain should not be distributed to the plebeians unless they relinquished their right to choose the Tribuni Plebis. For this he was banished. Having obtained command of a Volscian army, he marched against Rome, and came within 5 miles of the city. Here he was met by a deputation of his own citizens, who begged him to spare the city. He refused, but when his wife and mother added their tears, he was induced to withdraw the army. He was afterwards killed by the Volscians as a traitor. Footnote: see Shakespeare's Coriolanus. After the expulsion of Tarquin, the Fabii were among the most distinguished men at Rome. There were 3 brothers, and for 7 consecutive years one of them was consul. It looked as if the Fabian gens would get control of the government. The state took alarm, and the whole gens, numbering 306 males and 4,000 dependents, was driven from Rome. For 2 years they carried on war alone against the Veientes, but finally were surprised and slain (477). One boy, Quintus Fabius Vibulánus, alone survived to preserve the name and gens of the Fabii. In 458 the Romans were hard pressed by the Aequi. Their territory had been overrun, and their consuls, cut off in some defiles, were in imminent danger of destruction. Lucius Quinctus Cincinnatus was appointed Dictator. He was one of the most noted Roman warriors of this period. The ambassadors sent to inform him of his appointment found him working with bare arms in his field. Cincinnatus told his wife to throw over him his mantle, that he might receive the messengers of the state with proper respect. Such was the simplicity of his character, and yet so deeply did he reverence authority. The Aequi could not withstand his vigorous campaign, but were obliged soon to surrender, and made to pass under the yoke as a sign of humiliation. The Dictator enjoyed a well-earned triumph. In 451, one of the Decemviri, Appius Claudius, was captivated by the beauty of a patrician maiden, Virginia. (Footnote: See Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome.) A daughter of Lucius Virginius, and the betrothed of Lucius Icilius. He formed, with one of his tools, an infamous plot to obtain possession of Virginia, under pretense that she was a slave. When, in spite of all the efforts of the girl's father and lover, the Decemvir had, in his official capacity, adjudged her to be the slave of his tool, Virginius plunged a knife into his daughter's bosom, in presence of the people in the Forum. The enraged populace compelled the Decemviri to resign, and Appius, to escape worse punishment, put an end to his own life. Marcus Furius Camillus was a famous man of a little later period. He was called a second Romulus for his distinguished services. In 396 he captured Veii after a siege of 10 years. On his return he celebrated the most magnificent triumph yet seen at Rome. He was afterwards impeached for not having fairly divided the spoils obtained at Veii, and went into exile at Ardea. When Rome was besieged by the Gauls under Brennus, in 390, Camillus was recalled and made Dictator. At the head of 40,000 men he hastened to the city, raised the siege, and in the battle which followed annihilated the Gauls. He was Dictator 5 times, Interrex 3 times, Military Tribune twice, and enjoyed 4 triumphs. He died at the advanced age of 88. Brennus was the famous leader of the Senones, a tribe of Gauls, who invaded Italy about 390. He defeated the Romans at the river Allia, July 18, 390, and captured the city, except the capital, which he besieged for 6 months. During the siege he tried to surprise the garrison, but was repulsed by Manlius, who was awakened by the cackling of some geese. Peace was finally purchased by the Romans by the payment of 1,000 pounds of gold. To increase the weight, Brennus is said to have thrown his sword on the scales. At this juncture, as the story runs, Camillus appeared with his troops, ordered the gold to be removed, saying that Rome must be ransomed with steel and not gold. In the battle which followed, the Gauls were defeated. End of chapter 50. End of section 20. End of History of Rome, from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F. Pennell.